Hello everybody and welcome to another video. I had said I wasn't going to do a Guild Wars 2 Mysteries until I got the book Sea of Sorrow so I could read that. But I am going to do one. I have got the book, but I've not read it yet. But I'm going to do one anyway because, like, some crazy, awesome stuff is going on with the current living story. I put out a pretty pessimistic video a couple of days ago, basically about the way that Arenanet have been doing the story and the lore for the living story. One of my big criticisms for that was that they're just kind of not returning to any interesting plot lines. And I'm about to eat my words because something fantastic is going on. It looks like it's going to be really good, and I'm incredibly excited to see what they have in store. It is, right now, a big mystery. So I want to share that with everyone. A few guys over on Reddit know about it because someone made this awesome thread and did some great detective work. I want to do my own take on it, my own video. So yeah, saddle up guys. It's a lot to say, but it's very compelling, very interesting, and it's really current events. It's like it's on Arenanet's mind, and we're probably going to get answers to this very quickly. So I hope you enjoy. Today we are going to be talking about Glint mostly, or Gw2 as was her original name. So, for those of you that didn't play the first game, a lot of this is very steeped in Guild Wars 1 lore, which is one of the big reasons why I feel like this is quite exciting. Glint was actually revealed at the end of Guild Wars 2 in the final dungeon. There's going to be spoilers here for the second book and the final dungeon of Guild Wars 2, so just bear that in mind. In the final dungeon of Guild Wars 2, we learned that this creature called Glint, who we'd met in the first game that was a dragon, was originally a character called Gw2, who had been corrupted by Gw2. Okay? One of the elder dragons during the last cycle when they were awakened corrupted another dragon called Gw2, and she became known as Glint. And she was just like all of the other elder dragon champions we're currently familiar with. She was angry, she would kill things, she only wanted to listen to her master and consume magic. However, there came a time where the Elder Dragons before fell asleep again, and when that happened, Glint was sort of just left to wander the world. During this time, she came to interact with the Forgotten, who were one of the races on Tyria during that time, who actually learned how to cure dragon corruption, which is like a really big deal for the story, and that's going to mean a lot for the cleansing of ore and stuff. That's why this comes out in the final dungeon of Guild Wars 2. The Forgotten, one of these ancient races, had found out how to cleanse dragon corruption, and they did it to Glint. Glint was this great, powerful creature, and they did it to her, and she never became known as Gw2 again. Everyone just kind of still calls her Glint, but for all intents and purposes, she was no longer a minion of Gw2. She was a big-ass, powerful dragon with interesting magics, but she wasn't an enemy anymore. Over the years, the Forgotten and Glint 2, Glint leading them essentially from that point, the Forgotten looked over the world of Tyria and helped it to flourish and grow. But then eventually the gods came, the humans came, and the humans and the Char as well to an extent and other races pushed the Forgotten back. And slowly this race that were the protectors and really noble creatures essentially, these snake people, were pushed back into the Crystal Desert, a region we haven't got to play in Guild Wars 2 yet. And there they were literally almost forgotten by the other races of the world. None of the races that we're interacting with really know or understand who they are because there are so few of them now, and they've been pushed to this really remote, desolate, unlivable, inhospitable place on the planet, the Crystal Desert. So then, that's kind of where the world was during Guild Wars 1's time. You had the Forgotten in the Crystal Desert with their leader, Glint. One big thing about Glint, one big power she seemed to have, which is kind of unique actually, you don't see this much in the Guild Wars universe, she was prophetic. She could kind of see the future. And she foretold, in something called the Flame Seeker Prophecies, the collapse and extinction, as she saw it, of the Masat. And a lot of the first game, the first campaign of the first game revolved around this story of the Flame Seeker Prophecies. And there's kind of an insinuation there now with Guild Wars 2 that the reason why she wrote the Flame Seeker Prophecies, which were essentially self-fulfilling, was because the Masat had betrayed the Forgotten, and the Forgotten had been so nice to Glint and cleansed her. So that's kind of my understanding of why she might have done that now, all things considered. The Masat were the enemies of the Forgotten, and with Glint's help, they wrote the Flame Seeker Prophecies, which were self-fulfilling and ultimately led about the downfall of the Masat. But what's important is that during the events of Guild Wars 1, while you, the players, are enacting the Flame Seeker Prophecies, you actually go to meet Glint for counsel. After all, she wrote them, right? And you want to understand them, you want to know how to fight the Masat. So you actually go to visit Glint. Now, she lived inside a single crystal grain of sand within the Crystal Desert. Crystals are a massive theme of Gw2, the Elder Dragon who at one point bore her, or at least corrupted her, and Glint to herself. Crystals are a huge thing. and she had this almost impenetrable lair within a single crystal grain of sand, and the only way to get into that grain of sand was through a portal that was guarded by the Forgotten. So we as humans went into this crystal lair. It was defended by many different aspects of Glint, these different forms of dragons that embodied the different human magics about at the time, one for each profession basically, and we went through and we found Glint and we had a conversation with her. She told us how to fight the Massart, another portal opened, and we left. Okay, now there's more to that story which I'm going to have to come to later, just because it will make a lot more sense. After we left though, still staying with Guild Wars 1, after we left Glint, we came to the Shiver Peaks. These were an area back then that was heavily inhabited by dwarves. The dwarf society was going just fine at this time. And amongst those dwarves, we actually found a small subsection of them called the Brotherhood of the Dragon. Okay, now these were Deldrimor dwarves who maintained like a physical or spiritual connection with Glint, and they sort of worshipped her. And that's kind of weird for dwarves, because dwarves had a very specific religion about this thing called the Great Dwarf. And for a lot of the Brotherhood of the Dragon, they found they were sort of shunned by the rest of dwarf society, because it conflicted with their idea of the Great Dwarf, and they couldn't worship Glint too. But the Brotherhood themselves maintained that it wasn't really much of a spiritual thing. They just were interested in the practical applications of having this connection with this creature that can see the future, right, and has these powerful magics. And the Brotherhood of the Dwarf had constructed this shrine, basically, through which Glint could speak to them. And that shrine was used a lot by Glint later on in the story of Guild Wars 1, where she told you how to defeat the titans that were attacking the world. Now, it was kind of an interesting little bit of story, but there wasn't too much with the Brotherhood of the Dragon, and to me, honestly, it always felt kind of excuse plotty. It was like Arenanet wanted a way for us to interact with Glint, but without having to go back to her lair every time, and they didn't want her to have to leave her lair, so they were like, okay, we'll throw these dwarves in with this shrine. And I was perfectly fine with that. It was a little bit more depth to the story. They were an interesting sort of subsection of the dwarves, and that was that. Okay, now more stuff does happen in Guild Wars, but again, I'm going to skip, and it will make sense. Okay, so 5 years before Guild Wars 2, right? A long time in the future now. 5 years before Guild Wars 2, we have the events of the second Guild Wars novel. Okay, and this involved Destiny's Edge coming together, all these characters that we know from Guild Wars 2, Logan Thackeray, Ritlock Brimstone, Airster Gulking, and so forth. And they eventually hatch a plan to destroy Kraukatoric, who has just reawoken. And how do they decide to do that? Well, they try and use Glint as a bargaining chip, right? They try and basically set a trap for Kraukatoric. They know that when Kraukatoric wakes up, he's going to be pissed with Glint, because when he went to sleep, Glint was still under his control, and now she's not, and she's like rebelling, and she's scheming against him, so he's going to come for her, right? This is very, very basic how the plot goes. So they plot a trap. They go to where Glint is, and together the plan is Destiny's Edge, who have already done all these amazing things together, are going to team up with this badass dragon and kill Kraukatoric. And this is kind of where the spoilers come in. The plan fails. You probably know this if you've played Guild Wars 2. The plan fails. A lot of people like to blame Logan for that. But essentially, the group disbands. Their plan goes awry. And it causes the death of one of the members of Destiny's Edge, an Asura named Snaff, who was probably one of the most likable characters in the book. Surprise, surprise. It also caused the death of Glint herself. Kraukatoric beats Destiny's Edge up, a lot of them get away, Snaff doesn't, and then he proceeds to kill Glint. Now, there's a big bit in the book, basically, about how Snaff goes inside the Elder Dragon's mind, and there's a real theme of going into one another's minds. And don't forget, this was something we'd already seen with the Brotherhood of the Dragon, how they were maintaining this connection with Glint too. But the important thing here is Glint was dead. And now I'm going to talk to you about seemingly completely unrelated stuff. So, today in Guild Wars 2, for the past week, we've been introduced to the latest chapter of the Living Story. Once again, it seems to be just another kind of disjointed thing. It's not really related to the other stuff we were doing. It's just another plot for us to go for on the month. I did a big long video about how I feel like that affects the story and how Arenanet haven't been able to do a lot of interesting stuff. Well, you know, this is called the Bazaar of the Four Winds. We kind of have a bit of an excuse, and we go to meet a new group of people named the Zephyrite. Okay, now these are humans. There's no other races involved here, but they're mostly humans, it seems, from Canthan descent. There is a suggestion maybe some of them are from Elona, and originally all of these humans were Tyrian. But the idea of the Zephyrites are they are people who live really high in the skies, like on airships, and most of the time they are nowhere near the ground. They're in the upper atmosphere. Well, not the upper atmosphere. They're very high up in the sky, in places where most people can't see them. And they've learned to use these things called aspects, which are basically these very powerful magics that when you listen to the NPCs in the current new content, you actually hear one of them says, basically, that these magics that the Zephyrite use is what you get if you really intensely study air elementalism. So air elementalists in game right now, you know, they've got kind of rudimentary skills, I suppose, but these humans have been studying that branch of magic for a really long time, and they've learned all of this really cool stuff that allows them to maintain an existence in the sky. Now, they do need supplies though, so every now and then they will land in a different area, exploring the whole world, all of Tyria potentially, and they'll land for a little while and they'll trade goods. They'll offer things from all the different all four corners of Tyria, and they'll have stuff to offer people, and then the people will give them gold or whatever resources they need to stay afloat when they return to the skies. And this is kind of their culture, and the idea is that they started as just Tyrian humans, but over time they went to these different areas and picked other people out. Particularly, a lot of Canthans seem to have come, and you can see there's a lot of Canthan goods and wares among the Zephyrite. Now, they've got this thing called the Zephyr Sanctum, and that's the name of, like, basically the huge airship town city that they fly around on. And the Zephyr Sanctum is seen really rarely, okay? This is how rare this thing lands. No Sylvari alive had ever seen or heard of the Zephyrite, because since they'd last awakened, the Zephyr Sanctum hadn't arrived. So this idea that this Bazaar of the Four Winds is now happening, that they've landed once again, is kind of a monumental, exciting thing. You know, if it only happens roughly once every 30 years or so, as this would suggest, is going to be quite significant for the people living in Tyria. Otherwise, there's not too much more to know about the Zephyrite, as it would seem. There's a single Asura on their airship that seems to think that they're hiding something, but frankly, most of what they offer in their markets is all really weird black market stuff anyway, so really, it doesn't have to mean much. The Asura could just, you know, be another paranoid Asura, right? So, what's the point in this video? We've just got some more shallow extra living story stuff? Well, no. Actually, everything I've told you does seem to be connected in some way. Now, I will preface this. I didn't put this together. I listened to a lot of what the NPCs were saying while I was going for my title, and I did hear snippets here and there, but I didn't realize that it slotted together in a much bigger picture, so credit does go elsewhere on this one. But basically, there's a teacher, okay? This is the first thing I think you should really mention. There's a teacher on the back of the Zephyr Sanctum who's talking to these children about the Elder Dragons. And in particular, she mentions Glint. And that's kind of, I remember listening to that and I thought, oh, that's actually really cool that they've mentioned Glint. I didn't think there was any significance there, but it was cool that she mentioned Glint, that she knew who Glint was, that even that Glint had died, that a noble hero had also sacrificed their life defending Glint, which would be in regards to Snaff. And she even talks about the other members of Destiny's Edge and how she thinks that these are powerful people who will help us fight against the Elder Dragons. I thought that was really cool. I thought it was awesome to see Arenanet were honouring their lore there, and we had this little snippet of these other important characters that we haven't really seen that much in the living story, right? I thought it was pretty cool, but I left it there. There's another thing though. The Zephyrite have a song. And if you just listen to it very vaguely, you won't pick up on much stuff. But basically, if you listen closely to the lyrics, the song too is about Glint. It's like a whole thing about how Glint died and how tragic this whole story was. I'll give you a couple of lines. One line is, "Alas, her magic strewn in sand, alas, her soul undone." Another line is, "She flies no more in glinting beam and leaves a hollow hole." And another one, "Alas, alas, how time must pass, ancient magical friend." There's loads of lines. I think those are probably the most significant ones though. But this is very clearly a song about Glint dying. And all of a sudden it seems like it's a little bit more of a coincidence. Why are all these Zephyr people talking about Glint so much? And if you look slightly closer as well, I haven't seen so many people mention this, but I mentioned that Glint and Gw2, a big theme of them is crystals, right? I mean, Gw2 is the crystal dragon. Glint existed within a crystalline layer in the crystal desert. And like a massive thing you're doing in this new update is collecting crystals, either collecting the sky crystals for the Lessons from the Sky achievement, or you're literally walking around. These aspects themselves are crystals. Gw2 is like got this big thing with lightning magic, right, and air magic essentially, and that's all these Zephyrite are studying. This is like a massive study of theirs, is air elementalism through and through. Now, here's where it gets even better. On the official lore for the Zephyrite, they open up by saying, Generations prior to the rise of ore, a wise elder called the dwarves together and called them the protectors of heritage. Over time, guardianship was passed on to the humans, and basically those humans are the Zephyrites. So we've got this idea that the Zephyrites were formed when a wise elder called the dwarves together and called them the protectors of heritage. Who was this wise elder? Well, what if it was Glint? And what if she was calling the dwarves together? We're actually talking about the Brotherhood of the Dwarves. Now, that makes a lot of sense, because, and it's not a question I'd ever really considered for myself, but what did happen to Glint and her Brotherhood after all of the dwarves turned to stone and essentially left Tyria for the depths? What happened beyond that point? Surely she would need someone else. And that's the idea, that these Zephyrite are the new Brotherhood of the Dragon, and they are now doing Glint's work. But then, what are they doing? Glint's dead now, right? So what have they started doing since then? And also, and I'll come back to this, what does the Protectors of Heritage mean? Because that's what the new lore describes them as. The Protectors of Heritage, I will come back to that. So, some guys basically pieced this together and were like, look, there's definitely something going on with these Zephyrite and something to do with Glint. This is too many links to be a coincidence. And at that point, very quickly, Arenanet did something amazing. Like, they need to do this more. Really, they need to be putting these in game. But basically, before the game came out, their website was full of lore articles and all kinds of awesome stories and things that you could read as a player to get amped up about the story. And I am almost 100% sure I said it in videos before the game came out. I was very, very concerned that when the game finally launched, Arenanet wouldn't be able to deliver such compelling lore to us as an experience of the actual game. That the best lore would always be these short stories and things they were releasing on their website, rather than actual things we could read. Now, during the development of the game, I'm going way off topic, but during the development of the game, they were actually going to have in-game books that were at one point scrapped. So those fears were quelled for me for a while, but obviously we don't have in-game books. I think that's a big reason why the lore's kind of hard to follow in-game at this point. But anyway, they have finally, they don't do it enough, but they finally released another proper short story to their website. And what's the story about? It's about the Zephyrite visiting Glint's lair in the Crystal Desert. Now, this video is going to be so long if I read it. I'm going to do it a separate video, guys, where basically I do a reading of it and give you my opinions. I always enjoyed doing that before, and I'd love to do it again. It's a very cool story, but essentially, that's what it's about. It's a story on the year of Glint's death, Snaf's death, and the breaking of Destiny's Edge. It's a story from the Zephyrite now traveling to the desert to see if their master, Glint, is truly gone. And it's confirmation that these guys are the successors to the Brotherhood of the Dragon. In the story, they describe how they finally get there. There's all these wonderful descriptions of how desolate the Crystal Desert is that really, as again, I keep using the term, but honors what they'd said about the Crystal Desert in the first game. But you find out that when they get to where Glint had died, they find something. They find like some piece of Glint, I believe, as they describe it, and they take it with them. And they use this to seed new magics into their crystals, into their aspects, and it basically revolutionizes how the Zephyrite are working. To the point where now we see them in Guild Wars 2, just as the living stories come out, and they're jumping like 10 times the height of a normal man, or they're flying across the bridges at insane speed and just leaping through the air with lightning. Okay, so it describes how they found something there and took it with them. Now, what is it that they could have found? The story makes it sound like it's just like a shard of her actual body. But what is it that they could have found? Well, there's one more piece to the puzzle that's about the Brotherhood of the Dragon before they became extinct. So, let's rewind again to the stuff that I skipped when I was telling you the Guild Wars 1 story. Back in Prophecies, before leaving Glint's lair, after the humans go to meet her and seek her counsel, you could actually kind of explore the lair freely. After the cutscenes were over, you could kind of in-game kind of just explore this little section of her lair, and in there, in a corner stashed away, you could find a clutch of eggs that Glint had lain. Now, if you chose to interact with those eggs, Glint would basically get really mad and she'd attack you. And you as a player could then engage in what was known as a bonus mission where you'd have to fight her. And she, especially when the game first came out, it was a very difficult fight. And she would attack you, but if you managed to kill her, you'd get the bonus objective complete for that mission and you'd get to leave. But by winning that fight, you'd essentially killed Glint, right? So as far as we understood, it was sort of a non-canon bonus mission that never really affected the plot in any way. Because if you killed Glint, then she wouldn't have been able to have interacted with you later in the story, but she always did, and she never mentioned it. So it was kind of always this non-canon thing in a lot of people's eyes, but it was never confirmed to be non-canon, right? So it was in this weird place. It got put in an even weirder place when in Edge of Destiny, Glint specifically mentions that she was attacked by humans. And that really threw a spanner in the work, because I think a lot of us were contented to accept, okay, this is just like a bonus mission, don't worry about it. And then she actually mentioned that these humans had attacked her, and she seemed kind of annoyed about it in the book. So that really muddied the water, and nobody really understood what the true timeline of events was. And I think to this day, that's still kind of true. But the Zephyrite could explain that now. The Zephyrite becoming the successors of the Brotherhood of the Dwarves, when Glint mentioned she was attacked by humans, or at least had some interaction with humans between the events of Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2. Perhaps she's talking about at some point when she met up with the Zephyrite, and she chose these humans to become the new Brotherhood of the Dragon. How did that happen? What were the events there that caused that to begin? Well, maybe that explains that line of dialogue. There's also, in Guild Wars 1, this is a bit of an aside too, but something I've always found interesting. In Guild Wars 1, there's like loads of bodies littering the floor in one of like the aspects to reach Glint, and they're like human bodies from Ascalon, and there's never been any explanation for why they're there. And that kind of suggests, again, maybe there's been some outside interest in Glint on the human side for a while now. But anyway, that's all as an aside. What's interesting really are the eggs, this clutch of eggs. You see, that all happened in Guild Wars 1, the eggs were never returned to, none of that was returned to. But right at the end of Guild Wars 1, at the end of Eye of the North, the expansion Arenanet specifically made to lead them into Guild Wars 2, the expansion where they introduced all of the new races that were, except for even the Sylvari, where they introduced all of the new races and all of the primary lore that was going to be a major feature of Guild Wars 2. This expansion, they did something very weird at the end. You see, again, I thought that the Brotherhood were kind of excuse plotty, but at the end of Eye of the North, right before you fight Primordus' chief minion at the time, the Brotherhood of the Dragon come back. And that makes a lot of sense, because this is essentially an expansion about the rise of the Elder Dragons and the destruction of the dwarves, and we have a bunch of dwarves having already interacted with a dragon in the plot. So it's good that they return to the Brotherhood of the Dragon at this point. And it turns out that the Brotherhood of the Dragon want our help for one final challenge mission, because that egg, or at least one of the eggs from this large clutch that we saw in prophecies, one of them has hatched. And not only has it hatched, but it's grown a reasonable amount, and now Primordus' destroyers are trying to kill it. And that in itself, why Primordus' destroyers are trying to kill the now cleansed offspring of another Elder Dragon, is beyond me. That's a whole other topic. But Primordus is trying to kill this baby dragon. So Glint opens another portal to her lair, and you and the Brotherhood of the Dragon, right at the end of Eye of the North, go to defend and save her baby. And you succeed. And that's about it. Nothing else happens. I mean, they establish that there's a baby dragon that is incredibly interesting, and they never return to it. That's it. You know, they did a lot of other content after Eye of the North in Guild Wars 1, but there's no mention of the baby dragon anymore. They never so much as acknowledged that it existed in the lore at all. It was another one. It wasn't even mentioned in Edge of Destiny, when Glint was like a huge feature of that book, and there was loads of interaction there. There was no mention of her baby. There was no mention of her baby anywhere in Guild Wars 2 at all. It was another dead end, another little thing that kind of makes you lose faith a little bit that the devs really know what they're doing with the story, that they write this cool stuff and then just they're not interested for Guild Wars 2. They'd rather talk to us about Sky Pirates instead. And it was kind of sad. It was one of those things in a big list of things. Almost, you know, you can look at a lot of my mystery series and say that these are kind of the same thing. They're all dead ends that Arenanet might not be honouring. But now we have the Zephyrites, and all of a sudden, it restores a lot of your faith. The Zephyrite took over the dwarves' duties after they turned to stone and faded away. So, what have they been doing to help Glint? Particularly, now that Glint's dead, what are they doing? Did they know of the baby? What exactly did they find in the Crystal Desert just after Glint died? Was it just a piece of her body? Or maybe they had found her offspring, and now they're protecting the successor of Glint. What was it she called them when she banded them together? The Defenders of Heritage. That's what the Zephyrite are guarding. That's what they're using to fuse their crystals now and tap into her magic in a way they never thought was possible before. Suddenly, that Asura I mentioned ages ago that says that the Zephyrite are hiding something way more interesting than all of these artifacts that the Zephyrite have been trading with, suddenly that gets a lot more realistic. And that is honestly where I think that the living story is going to be going in the next few chapters. We're going to be looking again at a long long dead piece of lore that Arenanet are finally coming back to. And that's exciting for several reasons. One, because the story itself is compelling and will finally get a conclusion and will lead us potentially into a lot of other interesting directions. It could take us back to the Crystal Desert. It could point to Gw2 eventually being the next Elder Dragon we fight. It could even in some weird ways point to a conflict with Primordus, because he seemed to have some vested interest in this baby back in Guild Wars 1. It could even lead us back to the dwarves. It's leading us in a lot of interesting directions, cool stuff that Arenanet established a long time ago, and finally they're getting back to. But the other reason it's exciting is because it means that all of these other things too, they do still remember. All of these other little mysteries, all of these dead ends that just suddenly dropped, they're actually looking at them. They know that they're there, and this is finally, we have some evidence that they're going back to some very exciting stuff that they established a while ago. And that really ups my excitement about the living story. This is basically the mystery for you guys. Do they have a baby dragon, and what does that mean as we go forward with the living story? And I think we'll get an answer to this mystery possibly far quicker than we get an answer to any of the other mysteries I've done so far. I really wanted to share that with everybody because, you know, I did this video recently where I criticized the living story for basically telling its stories in a disjointed way, which it still sort of is doing, but also for just not going back to the interesting lore in the first place, for just giving us these stupid new things that they've concocted for once a month. This looks like the start of a really long, really interesting story. And now I filled you guys in, basically. That's everything we know about it from Guild Wars 1, through the books, through to Guild Wars 2, and what we've got now going forward with this story of Glint. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope we do find an answer to this mystery soon enough. And I guess I will see you next time. As I say, I'm going to be reading Sea of Sorrows in the future. But yeah, thanks very much for watching, guys. And let me know what you think, honestly. There's probably some little things to this story I've not actually tapped into myself yet. But we'll see it as it goes forward. I'll keep you all up to date on as the living story progresses. So thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time.